Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, I feel like we have been talking about inflation for years now, since the Biden administration here in the US and also globally too. Inflation has impacted people around the world. There are still many countries that have high inflation. And we still talk about it here in the US in terms of that it's high and things like that, although it's not really by national standards anymore. But inflation has been kind of all the rage over the past couple of years. So I searched high and low to find some folks that have written on it. And I found two lovely gentlemen. Mark Blyth, he is a professor of international economics and a director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. He typically studies the politics of growth, distribution, decarbonization, and why people continue to believe dubious economic ideas despite so much evidence on the contrary. Also on the podcast is Nicolò Fraccaroli. I know, again, I butchered it when I talked to him. I'm butchering it again. He's an economist at the World Bank and a visiting scholar at Brown University. He's got a master's in political economy of Europe from the London School of Economics and a PhD in economics from the University of Rome. He's also was a postdoc research associate and adjunct professor at Brown University before joining the World Bank. And he has worked with the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, Inter-American Development Bank, and many, many other outlets. And the two of them are the author of the book Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. And that's what we talk about. We define inflation, what it is. It's actually not easy to do in some regards. People have different ideas and definitions of inflation. They give the positives and negatives of inflation and how prices are measured. We talk about housing interest rates, the Federal Reserve here in the United States, inflation in the 70s. That comes up a lot, currently and in the book. I mean, the 70s were a big time for global inflation, especially in the US as well. We talk about the Biden stimulus packages and bills that were passed. We talk about hyperinflation in places like Turkey and Argentina. We talk about Trump's tariffs and what's going to happen there, and many other topics. I learned a lot in this conversation, obviously in reading their book about inflation. I'm not an economist, obviously, so it was great to talk with them and to really try to break it down and make it as easy to understand for most people to kind of walk away and say, okay, I have a little bit better understanding of what inflation is. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. So get over there and subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Mark Blyth and Nicolò Fraccaroli. I am here with Mark Blyth and Nicolò Fraccaroli. Sorry if I butchered that. Mark, Nick, thanks for coming on the podcast. I am excited to talk with both of you about your book. So thanks for coming on.
That's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes. So the book is Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. That's a great subtitle. So we'll talk all about it. Why don't you both kind of introduce yourself, just say what you do, kind of your day job professionally, academically, and then how you both came to write the book.
Okay. My name is Mark Blyth. I'm a political economist at Brown University. And I'm not going to introduce Nick. He can introduce himself, but he was a postdoctoral student of mine, and the book is his fault. So any errors and omissions are entirely his responsibility. Over to you, Nick.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicolò Fraccaroli, and I'm an economist at the World Bank. Everything I'm going to say, again, is my fault, completely unrelated to my job at the World Bank, because indeed it's something that I did in my capacity as a postdoc at Brown University, where I'm still affiliated as a visiting scholar, so still very attached to academia.
That's nice. So tell us, how did you just before we started, you were kind of mentioning it, and you mentioned it in the beginning of the book. How did you guys kind of come to write the book together? I mean, obviously you were working together, I'm assuming, but who had the idea? How did you shape it? Who did what writing or research? How did it work?
So I came with the idea and I showed up at Mark's office or even at his house, probably.
I think it was the original pitch was at the office.
It was at the office, yeah. Because I was listening about a lot of news about inflation. It was 2021 when the whole debate started. We started seeing prices rising. And even for us, for people that really like deal with economics on a daily basis, it was really, really a mess. Like it was very difficult to understand what was going on. Like people were saying we had inflation for very different reasons, and we thought like, Mark, I think like there was like a lack of a guidance, of a guide actually, that would let us understand what was going on, and also like that would give us some stories that is maybe like different from the stories that we hear normally.
It's nice. Mark, and you decided, sure, why not? I'll do it.
Yeah, I got nothing else going on. No. When you first came to me, it was like, why? Why do this? So about 10 years previously, I'd written a book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. And Nick had also written a book on austerity, about sort of the debate over austerity, particularly in Europe. And he came to me and he said, no, this is monetary austerity. And I said, why? What do you mean? He says, well, think about it, right? The people who are the bottom end of the income distribution, the poor, right? They already have crap access to credit. They already overpay massively for their credit. When you raise interest rates, they get doubly punished. They're more likely to be unemployed, and then they already have to pay even more for credit that's hard to come by in the first place. If you're at the top end of the income distribution, you're sitting on a pile of assets, they raise interest rates, you make money. So there's a huge distributional story here that we never hear about. And, one of the lines, there's many lines that we quote people in the book, and one of them was, I think it was a former Fed chair, who said that inflation's everyone's problem. We all feel it. And, what Nick pointed out to me was actually, that's really not true. And I thought, well, there might be something more interesting here than we thought, which is the kind of standard story about inflation, which we got from the 1970s, which is either comes from the labor market, people pushing up wages, pushing up prices, or the government spent too much money, which was very much the trope that also motivated this, in the sense that, yes, there was the pandemic, the government spent an absolute ton of cash, we know that that's true, but they were dealing with a shutdown of 80% of the labor market. I don't know why they called these things stimulus checks. They should have just called them safety checks or compensation checks, right? It wasn't go out and party your ass off checks. So there was plenty there once we started picking at it to get into.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we'll definitely come to 2021 and during the pandemic. So there's this I forgot where this quote comes from. You will know it's in the book, and I've heard it as well. Is that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon? Who's the one that coined this term? I forgot what this phrase. I forget who it is.
So Friedman.
Friedman, yeah, that's right. Right. So yeah, I mean, tell us. Just like like nobody, like you're telling a group of middle schoolers or something, or high schoolers, for just real basic. For folks, what is inflation? How you talk about it as a general and sustained rise in level of prices, but yeah, what is it? What is it that we're always talking about, and how can we have a good operational definition so people know what it actually is and what it isn't? I guess.
Well, inflation is a general increase in the average prices, and I think it's important to focus on the word increase in this case, because it's not just that prices are going up and everything is going to be more costly, but it's also really about the rate of change. So the fact that prices are changing and are going up, and so everything becomes more costly. So with the same money, you can't really buy the same amount of things. So the purchasing power, the so-called purchasing power, is reduced. So you can buy less stuff. Why am I talking about increase? Because this is a bit different from the price level. So you may have noticed that now things got better in terms of the inflation rate. So we don't have an inflation that is as high as it was a couple of years ago, but things are still very expensive because that's the price level, whereas inflation is really focusing on how much prices are going up.
Mark, anything you want to add here?
Oh, there's so much to add. Yeah, okay, so that's basically what it is. Remember the disconnect that people were talking about just before the election, that there was a reported rate of inflation and people were saying that's not my rate of inflation. Let's build on that for something next talking about. When the public think about prices, they think about the price level. And one way to think about this is think of a glass of water. So imagine you've got a glass of water in front of you and it's half filled. Imagine I add another 25% to the glass. The level has gone up and it's not going down. Now, that's what everyone experiences, and they say eggs have gone up, rents have gone up, things are more expensive, and they're not coming down. This is outrageous. And then you have our tribe basically sitting around going, yeah, but actually inflation's coming down. And everyone goes, what are you talking about? Everything's still so expensive. It's because we don't look at the level of the glass. We look at basically how fast or how slow it's filling up. And if it's filling, basically we look at the surface tension on the glass, and we basically say that's the delta, that's the rate of change, that's what we're focusing upon. So this disconnect to people feels really interesting, because they are right to focus on something different, because people care about the price level. They don't actually care about the rate of change. The second thing is John Otters, who's a wonderful financial journalist at Bloomberg, did something really interesting just after the book came out. One of the things that statisticians do to smooth the underlying rate of inflation. So how do you calculate an inflation rate? We can get into this as much as you like. The Fed, for example, takes 80,000 prices and just every month checks if they are still around as things, substitute other things in, take them out. How much have they gone up? How much have gone down? You add all that together in a big sum, and basically that's your inflation rate. Now, what John Otters did was to say the reason people feel a disconnect is because a lot of the stuff that people really care about, food, fuels, rents, etc., particularly food and fuels, are what are called seasonally adjusted items. Right, you use more gas in the winter than you do in the summer, this sort of stuff. So they tend to take these things out to look at what we call core inflation. Now, the problem is most people don't actually consume 80,000 things. They consume a lot less, and a lot of it is food and fuel. So what John did was to calculate anti-core. And when you calculate anti-core, it was double, if not more than double, the official rate of inflation. So what people were feeling was actually a very different inflation rate. And that goes back to a wider point that we can get into about how you consume and what you consume really determines how you feel inflation. And that varies across the income distribution.
So yeah, so that when you're talking about the kind of 80,000 thing, the items the Fed is looking at every month, that's what is when they say inflation is 6.8 or 9%
exactly.
or whatever it is.
The average of all of those
is.
things has gone up by X amount or down by X amount. That's exactly it.
So, and again, it's more of how fast or how slow that level is rising. It's not necessarily how it's correlating with whatever the price of goods or gas or things are. It's more of how in terms of inflation, it's more of how fast it is.
Right. And if you think about this from public policy point of view, that kind of makes sense, because what you're interested in is, unless you're going to institute nationwide price controls, it's very hard to basically regulate the price of items. And history tells us doing that usually backfires. Not always, but usually backfires. So you're kind of stuck with levels. So what you want to do is you want the level to stop rising. Right. So that's why you focus on the rate of change.
So inflation isn't, but I think a lot of people see inflation as a negative thing, like if it's too high. So if inflation is 17%, they'll say, oh, that's terrible. But maybe not quite right. You say that inflation can be good if it's moderate. So again, it's about the level of it. Could you talk about, I mean, again, it's not like this sort of discrete category of good or bad. It's more of, you do need inflation. You do need some of that. Can you explain how we need it or why it's not always a bad or negative thing?
Well, I think it's easy to understand it when you think about why the opposite is bad. So when prices are falling, we may think that this is good because things are going to be cheaper. But if you think about it from a broader perspective, it's not that good, because if prices keep falling, then it means that you imagine yourself buying a car. Like, you know that this car tomorrow will be a bit cheaper, and the day after will be even cheaper. Of course, this can be days or it can be years, and this may induce you to wait to buy that car. So if you expand this to a number of people, and you don't think only about households, only people, but like firms that have to invest a huge amount of money into buying capital, into buying machinery and everything like that, This means that everyone is really delaying their investment. So if prices keep falling, no one really wants to invest because it's never convenient to invest. And this creates a situation where there is low investment, so firms are not spending their money, so they're not hiring new workers because everything's going to be cheaper in the future. And so it's very difficult in a situation where prices keep falling to really decide when it's the right moment to invest. If you turn it around, of course, if prices are growing too fast, if you have like what we call in the book bad inflation, or even worse, ugly inflation or hyperinflation, then it's becoming very difficult to really think about buying anything, because people can rush to the market, like they can buy too much stuff, a bit like what we saw during COVID. But a good amount of inflation that is not too high, but it's indeed a moderate amount of inflation, would allow you to still think that it's good to do an investment because things will be a bit more expensive in the future, but not too much indeed to rush and buy everything today. So this is a very simple explanation. Of course, there are other factors that affect it, but this is, I guess, the more intuitive way to see why moderate inflation is good and why central banks all around the world tend to target an inflation rate that is generally around 2%. So prices that grow at a 2% rate. Then why this number? Is it the right number? There is a big debate around it, and if you want, we can talk about it.
So if I go and I buy a car and they say your car is $20,000, right? Let's say, and then in 6 months the car is $16,000. That's not a good thing, right? Because then it's like, well, I paid more and now it's cheaper. And if it's happening too fast, and then in a year later it's $10,000. Now, I don't think this ever really happens, but or the reverse, right? If it's $20,000 today, and then in 6 months later it's $25,000, and then a year later it's $30,000. Be like, whoa, like that's too much. It's more of this kind of thing. Is this what you're saying?
And that's and it's exactly that. And that's why if you look at if you really have a lot of time to spend on this and you want to check what the objectives of central banks actually are, they don't say that their objective is to keep inflation low, but they say that their objective is to keep prices stable, because they're really not just afraid of inflation, but they're also very afraid of deflation, which is actually what we experienced before COVID.
I guess one question here is sort of like a kind of a macro question, and then sort of a smaller question. So most people think about, I go to Starbucks and my coffee is $7, not $5.50 like it was. What the hell? This is ridiculous. You know, everyone talks about the price of eggs or $8 or $12, and again, all these things or whatever, right? You know, maple syrup's too much money, or my toilet paper's $20 or whatever it is. But that's different than when you're working with big economic systems for major countries, right? So there's the price of goods, of course, but then when you have to deal with a country like the United States, or let's say Germany, or let's say the United Kingdom, or whatever, isn't it like you have to look at like countrywide where you're going to set things, and that might mean based on certain areas, certain people are going to pay more, are going to pay less for a variety of reasons, whether it's, trade or whether it's other things that are included. I mean, how do we see that? Obviously, inflation and interest rates doesn't just work for, shopping goods or, your coffee. It also has to work with, how people are making certain types of investments, other bigger mass things that are produced or, imported or exported. Like, how do we kind of look at it both from a big macro lens like that, and then also like everyday kinds of things for people's, wallets or whatever?
Well, I would say that the key thing is when we care about inflation because it either augments or reduces your ability to consume. And the inflation rate, if you think about what it's called in the US, the CPI, right, the Consumer Price Index. There's other indexes, there's producer prices, there's all this sort of stuff, imports, etc. But what we actually care about is consumption, because basically 80% of the economy is driven by consumption. So what you care about is consumption goods and your ability to consume or not. So how does that scale? Well, it scales two ways, one of which we've touched on and we can talk more about, which is essentially if you're shopping at, let's say, Dollar General, and inflation goes to 10%, you and your family have some serious choices to make about what you can put on the table. If you're shopping at Whole Foods, clearly you're inflation immune because you're already paying an insane amount for groceries voluntarily. which means that proportionally you're spending less of your income on consumption because you probably got a bigger income. So the effects vary across the income distribution. The other one is, how does it scale across countries? Well, it depends on the sector. Some sectors are more hit than others. Some sectors are highly concentrated. One of the reasons eggs are up in the United States more than anywhere else isn't just bird flu. Everybody has to deal with bird flu. It's the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of egg producers, but there's really just 2 buyers. And those 2 buyers basically take advantage of the fact that prices are going up to then shove prices up and make more money out of it. Now, the thing is, are they profit gouging? Well, we don't know, because it could simply be the cost of the inputs to making chickens, right? Whether it's the feed or whether it's the cost of fuel for keeping them warm or whatever it happens to be. That's gone up, and then they're paying more to buy the eggs in the first place. So it's not, just because prices go up and just because firms have raised prices, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily profit gouging, right? And it varies across different sectors and different parts of the economy. But the key thing that we're interested in is really this distributional story, basically how it varies across the income distribution, and also the different stories we tell about inflation, which is a key hook in the book that we should probably get into, because we talk about it in very different ways. And when you talk about it in different ways, you're identifying different, not just winners and losers, but who's to blame and who has to suffer the pain.
Yeah, I definitely want to come to those parts of it. I think currently at the moment, inflation in the U.S. is 2.6, something like this. Is that right?
It's low. Down.
I think it's low.
Just wait, it's coming back.
But nobody would know that. Everyone would say like, "Oh yeah,"
because it's levels again, right? It's levels.
Right.
Nothing came down, right? No, when the pandemic hit, I got a mate of mine who runs a building firm. And he said, watch this, everything's going to go through the roof. And I said, well, because of the supply chains. And he said, yeah, but also because when it goes up, it never comes down. So proof of this is he's building his own house just now. And when he drew up the plans prior to COVID, the house is going to cost him, and he runs a firm, right? $850,000. It's now cost him $1.2 million to build the same house. And he runs the firm. So he's not profit gouging himself, right? So basically shit don't come down once it goes up. And that's why people get annoyed with it.
Yeah.
So when you turn around and say, yes, it's really low now, it's only 2.6%, everyone quite rightly says, you people are full of shit, because ultimately things cost a bloody fortune.
Right. Well, that's the thing, right? Just make it easy. If my coffee at Starbucks costs $7 now, because inflation comes down, it doesn't go back down to $5.50 or whatever it was. It stays there. Right?
Yeah. And first of all, you shouldn't be drinking at Starbucks. It's terrible coffee. I highly recommend Coffee Nero. There's my product placement.
I do not drink Starbucks. I do not drink Starbucks at all. I would rather drink.
I went into a local coffee shop that's open near the Brown campus, and I asked for a green tea. And they said $5.25, like for a tea bag, literally, and some water. And then they asked me if I'd like to leave a tip.
No.
Yeah, and you wonder why people are furious, right?
No. Yeah, no. I have strong opinions about that as well. Yes, yes. Only in the United States, and less likely around the world to do that. Okay, so let me ask you: how do we measure inflation? You were bringing this up, so we talk about this. You said there's personal consumption expenditures (PCE). There's also consumer price index (CPI). How do we do it, and how do other countries do it? Do most people use kind of an analogous sort of measurement, or how does it look in the U.S. as opposed to Italy or Scotland or Turkey, or what does it look like?
Yeah, no, it's really like the concept is the one of a basket. So statisticians, they create baskets of goods and services. So there isn't just like the cost of gasoline, but it could be like also a doctor visit or a hairdresser. And what they do is to collect these prices on a monthly basis, generally, by really like doing online web scraping, telephone surveys, going actually to the retail store and check the prices. And this is done on a monthly basis. As Mark was saying, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US does it for the CPI on over 80,000 goods on a monthly basis. In other countries, they do different baskets, like different amount of goods, but it's the same in Europe. In the UK, they also create their own consumer price index. And what they do is also to assign some weight to each of these goods and services, because of course, like you don't use the same goods in the same amount. Maybe you use a lot of, you spend a lot of your income in gas or in in food, but you don't spend it as much on something that could be like floppy disk. Like the weight of floppy disk, for instance, in consumer price indexes has decreased substantially since they became useless and no one really used them anymore. And so, as Mark was saying, there are different indexes that are based on what you really decide to put into this basket. But also like based on the differences in terms of how you weight them. And of course, like also across countries, they weight differently. I assume that the inflation index in Italy gives more weight to pasta than the one in the US, for instance, because it's consumed more there than in the US.
Real pasta, not the
real
stuff,
pasta,
not stuff
exactly.
we have here. Yeah, right, yeah. That's very interesting. Okay, so it is sort of similar. There's some differences, but they just might kind of get it differently, but the different basket, but it's a similar kind of concept.
Yeah, and what you do is to track these prices in the basket, and what you're focused on when you talk about inflation is really the rate of change of this basket from month to month.
One of the ones that we get into in the book is the whole note of housing, right? Because if inflation is a measure of consumption goods, you don't eat houses, right?
No.
But you do, in a sense, consume rents. But if you own your own house, you're actually building an asset, and an asset is not consuming. So how the different central banks treat housing is really interesting. So the United States does this thing called owner's equivalent rent, which basically tries to accommodate how much you spend on housing if you own a house by basically, and it's a high ownership society, relatively speaking, what would it cost you to rent this? Now, there's loads of problems with this because single family homes are not the same as condos. And a single family home in the burbs is not something that you see often for rental. Right, but at least it's an honest attempt to put in the fact that people, do spend a lot of money on housing. The Bank of England just gave up doing this about 20 years ago. They just stopped. I think in part because house prices in Britain were on a tear, as they usually are, and if you kept them in the index, it would have produced a much higher inflation rate. And today, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, the ECB's been thinking about how to do this, but the sheer complexity of like 27 different housing markets, like, how would you possibly even come up with something that would work? So add to this the fact that we strip out food and fuel and so on and so forth, and there's a legitimate debate to be had about, what we're actually measuring and whether this captures the thing that we're afraid of and we're trying to control.
Sorry, I kind of got stuck on. So what do they not do? They just don't include it in England?
Don't include it. No, there's not.
Interesting.
Yeah. You can make sausages with very different ingredients.
Right. So tell us, I mean, where does this factor in, I guess, in terms of housing, people talk about interest rates. So, interest rates, I think, are 6% or 8.8% in the United States for housing, which is, it's not great, but it's not the worst. Some people have got their houses, back in 2020 or 21 for 2.5 or 3%, which is great. I mean, I guess, but I think it got up to like 10 or 12% interest at one point, or very high, very, very high. I mean, how does this kind of what you're saying? You don't consume houses. It is a kind of a source of wealth for most people. How do we factor that into how we understand, like, okay, why is my house 7.5% interest when 4 years ago it was 2.5%? Like, how does that factor in? What's the difference here? Is there a difference?
No, I think that's really the heart of the problem. One of the questions that we posed to ourselves when we started writing this book, because that's why indeed it looks very weird that to fight inflation you're going to raise the interest rate, because people are already seeing prices going up, the grocery going up, but even house prices going up, and yet the solution is to make more expensive to you also like the cost of a mortgage, for instance. And if you want to really dig deeper into that, it's even weirder that if you look at the different indexes, for instance, in the US, there are two main indexes. One is the consumer price index, and the other one is the PCE, the personal consumption index. And as I was saying, like they differ in the weights that they give to different elements. And the housing, for instance, takes into account, like it takes around 33%, like 1/3 of the weights of the CPI, of the consumption. and it's around 15%, so way lower in the PCE. And the Fed preferred index is actually the PCE. So when the Fed is actually getting worried about inflation, is getting worried about an index of prices that includes housing way less than the other index of prices. And when it tries to affect inflation, it increases a rate that indeed percolates, that it influences as well the mortgage rate. And so it's very difficult to try to understand how this can be a solution. I can see how in the long term they say they see this as a solution, because of course by raising the interest rate you want people to invest less, to buy less, because you're gonna reduce consumption as there is less frenzy in buying stuff. This should bring prices down, because of course there isn't as much demand as there was before. But to do that, you have to do something that is very harmful, that is to make an even additional item more pricey than what was already very expensive.
And I guess this also has issues in certain places for housing than in other places. So I mean, I think it's been well established of how very difficult it is in California to buy a house. If there's houses available, but they're just astronomically expensive. I mean, they're terribly expensive, more than in somewhere in Illinois or something like that. So I mean, yeah, it seems like there's within kind of the U.S. certain regions have different kind of markets. I mean, in D.C., people have talked about how housing is crazy, but even to rent apartments or condos in D.C. it's absurd. It's absurd. I mean, why is there no like kind of averaging, or there's a kind of like flattening out, so that way that isn't what's occurring? I mean,
that goes well beyond inflation. I mean, this goes to the fact that we stopped building houses for normal people across the world in the 1980s. And then we basically deregulated finance and turned housing into an asset class. So you've got a restricted supply, huge amount of new credit, prices go up. I mean, what's interesting about that is people talk about house price inflation, but it's not an inflation. Inflation, as Nick says, is a rise in the general level of all prices, right? Sustained rise in the general level of all prices. You can have healthcare going up. It's not a healthcare inflation. When stock prices go up, it's not a stock market inflation, right? But we tend to talk about housing because of the centrality of housing to our lives. I mean, a 1/3 weight in the index seems about right to me, in the sense that probably most people are spending a third or more, particularly if they live in one of these cities, on housing. This also has to do with the fact that we've basically got our whole geography of growth in countries very different now. Once you sort of globalize the world economy, cities on coasts become really, really important, and cities in the hinterland kind of decay and become less important. And this is true for Manchester and London as it is for like Duluth versus DC. So there's a whole host of factors go into this that shouldn't actually be confused with inflation, actually.
That's fair. So I guess the question, this will kind of tie in together, is who's doing all of this? Why is it, a company can say, you know what, this is more expensive to get these materials or these goods to build a house or to supply a store or to whatever. And then we got to pay more for our workers and all these things. So we're going to raise the price of goods. It has nothing to do necessarily with inflation per se, but I guess that's on one level. But on the other level is the kind of bigger one, which is, and you've heard people say this stuff for, decades of the Fed, and people don't like the Fed. We should end the Fed, all this libertarian dream of sorts. I never hear the replacement for it. It's just, end the Fed. And it's like, okay, so, what do you do after that? But could you just explain, I guess, in simple terms? People will kind of read on their phone or whatever. They'll see a news piece come in saying, Fed is raising interest rates, and everyone doesn't know what that means, right? Or, so when they're raising interest rates, or they're lowering, or they're trying to adjust for this, what is the piece here with interest rates, and how did higher interest rates increase the cost of borrowing?
Well, that's simply by increasing the interest rate, you make liquidity, so money, more expensive. So you have to pay more to borrow. Like you borrow the same amount of money, but you have to pay a higher interest rate in the future. So it is less convenient to borrow. And this really connects to all the decisions that we were mentioning before. So if you want to buy a car and you want to borrow some money to buy it, it's going to be more expensive for you. If you're a firm and you want to buy more capital, it's going to be more expensive to you. The way that the Fed controls this is to move interest rates for banks, and the thing is, like, we tend to assume that this works smoothly in a way that is sort of taken, that is given, but it's not always that easy. So in the sense that the channel through which interest rates are really able to impact inflation is something that is very uncertain, that generally takes a lot of time. So usually there are different studies that have different results, but for a higher interest rate to reduce inflation, it may take from 1 year to 3 years, depending on different estimates. And there are even central bankers that during the recent inflation crisis were very uncertain about the actual effects that hiking interest rate could have had on inflation. There was one of the members of the board of the European Central Bank that said that increasing interest rate by 1 percentage point could have reduced inflation in a range that was between 0.9 percentage points or 3.9 percentage points, which translates into like resolving inflation to doing very little to really reduce it. And so the concern here, and this is also what we talk about in the book, is that when you're not that sure about the actual impact that you can have on inflation, you have to be very careful. You have to be very cautious in increasing rates, because what we are sure about is that this comes at a very high cost, because we're sure about its impact on mortgages that you were mentioning, its impact on the loans that you can get from banks in general, like not only as a household but also as a firm. But we're not really sure about how impactful it can be on inflation. And of course, now we saw rates going up, inflation going down. But some economists have also argued this is a bit early, like for inflation to go down, given when we started raising rates and given the estimates that we have on that. So we're not really that sure about how much hiking rates was a contributing factor in reducing inflation, because this depends also how much on how much inflation is demand-driven versus supply-driven.
Mark, can you explain to me, if you know about, or Nick, about this end the Fed thing? Why do people want to do this, and what would be the alternative? I mean, this sounds like just a bunch of bullshit. I mean, I don't understand it, and I never hear the alternative. But maybe make the case after of why you do need a federal. We need a central bank. Damn it! Like you need that if you have a country of 350 million people, or even just tell us about this, I guess.
All right. So imagine a world in which you don't have a central bank. It was the United States in the 19th century.
We didn't for a long time.
Right, for a long time, right? And to many people that was the golden age. Well, it was also the golden age of bank runs and banks going bust and people losing their savings, and then firms not having any working capital and people being unemployed. And we pretty much decided, along with everyone, that having a lender of last resort, that is somebody who can come in with cash and basically stabilize these bank runs, is probably a good idea. What people object to in many ways is the structure of the Fed, because it's not a fully public institution. Half the board is basically private people running private banks as private sector representation on it. People think this is unfair because let's say you run a taxi firm, right? You don't get a bailout if you screw up your taxi firm, but you do get a bailout if you screw up a bank. So why do they get the special treatment? There's a democracy angle on this. There's a really great book that just came out called Our Money by a woman called Leah Downey, which goes into this, which basically says, look, it's all fine and well pretending that monetary policy, raising and lowering interest rates, etc., is apolitical, but it's not. When you raise interest rates, you benefit savers and you punish borrowers and vice versa. And also, Congress is meant to be the thing that authorizes the Fed, but we've created a monster whereby these technocrats run off and decide how much money should cost, and then they come to the Congress once a year and mansplain us with a bunch of technical jargon why they're all so clever and you're all dumb, and we all go, yeah, okay, fine, that's it. So there are legitimate complaints from a variety of purposes about, central banks and how they work.
Sure.
So if you end the Fed, what happens? Well, basically you go back to an era of free banking, and lots of people will lose their savings, and you will have crazy. If you want to see this, we're going to do it. We're going to do it with crypto now that basically the administration has decided basically what you'll have is a world as if the only thing that works is that works like a crypto world, and you will have booms and busts, and people will rob exchanges, and things will go crazy, parabolic, and then crash. And basically, after a while, we decided that was a bad idea. It's nice to have kind of monetary stability, and that's what central banks aim to do.
Yeah, that's nicely said. So we're going to take a little bit of history, and then some of the case examples you give in the book, and this will kind of lead to the thrust of the book about kind of the distribution piece that you guys were talking about earlier. So, I mean, this is sort of the undercurrent I got when I was reading the book. I feel like economists are traumatized. There's like this collective traumatization of sorts. I'm being a bit, tongue in cheek here, but from the 70s, everyone talks about the 70s as like, oh man, that was the worst time ever. There was all these issues. So you can hit this at any point that you want, but maybe we can talk about Volcker and with the Volcker rule, why he was important, and his interest rates brought inflation down.
Or perhaps they didn't.
Or perhaps he didn't.
They didn't, right? Exactly.
Right. Then you had the price controls with Nixon and his three phases. So tell us about this time of the 70s. What was going on in the 70s that was just a mess economically?
All right. So what was going on in the 70s? Lots of things. Okay. So basically, we decided at the end of World War II that allowing banks and financiers to bet against each other's currencies and tariffs and all the sort of stuff was bad because it ended up World War II and the Great Depression. So we built a bunch of economies that basically made loads of similar stuff and occasionally traded real things with each other. There was no globalization of finance. You couldn't move money easily from country to country. We did this because we wanted investment to stay at home, right? I mean, so much of what the National Conservative agenda, the MAGA agenda is basically animated from similar concerns that are perennial concerns, right? But nonetheless, you do this, and ultimately what you do is you target full employment because you don't want unemployment to be a big problem again. And when you run an economy as a full employment economy and you don't really have any way of moving your capital out, what happens is eventually wages are going to rise faster than productivity gains. And that means profits are going to fall. And when profits fall, you don't do capitalism anymore and you stop investing. And then the rate of growth slows down and then inflation kicks off. And that was kind of the hothouse, environment of the 1970s. And basically, business wasn't making any money anymore. And inflation, in a way, is a tax on profits and future investment. If you think that you're going to get 5% real after deductions and after all your taxes, etc., and inflation goes to 6%, you just, why would you bother, right? So inflation became a big problem that needed to be solved. And this is where you get a kind of an official history of the 1970s. So what happened? Well, two things. Basically, the government was spending far too much money, and that's kind of true. And also the labour market overheated, was kind of true. And that led to firms to push up prices to maintain profits. And we got this wage price spiral. And then the government did exactly the wrong thing with that, which is basically pump even more money into it. So what we needed to do was to control inflation. The only way you can do this is if you have someone who's not basically in the political mix. That would be Paul Volcker, who was running the Fed. Paul Volcker comes along, jacks interest rates up to 16%, 20% nominal at one point, and the economy craters because suddenly everything's super expensive. You can't borrow money to save your life. Large parts of the Midwest industrial basin, which are already creaky with really bad finances, really start to collapse. This is when you get the origins of the Rust Belt, etc., etc. And that was all bad. And he was very much a guy who was not in public favor for about 2 years. But then inflation disappeared because basically, as the economists would have it, people's expectations of future prices going up and up and up, which they'd come to expect, was now revealed to be not a good way of thinking about it because everything now costs a fortune because of this hike in interest rates. And therefore, we reset our expectations and then they went down. What's the take-home lesson? Independent central banks, good. Inflation is controlled by interest rates. And if you don't do that, you'll never control inflation. So this was the standard story that I was brought up with. This is the one that I thought was pretty much okay. And then we started to do the book and we went, oh, maybe that's not quite the story. So Nick, do you want to pick it up there as to maybe why this is not quite the story?
Yeah, tell us, Nick. What's the real story? Give us the updated history lesson.
Well, no, I think there were definitely some lessons to learn, but then we kind of assumed that this was the story that would have informed all the future decisions, and it was going to be always the case that things were going to work that way. Mark, for instance, mentioned the wage price spiral, which is this fear that as prices go up, workers are asking for higher wages because they need more money to buy more expensive goods. And this is gonna when firms agree on that, wages go up, and so firms have higher costs, so they have to pay higher wages, which is going to be transferred to the prices that they charge, and this is going to go into a spiral. For instance, we saw that if you look at historical evidence, this is something that can happen, but it's very rare. Like it doesn't happen really that frequently, and it's not us saying it. We mentioned we quoted this working paper from the International Monetary Fund that did an historical study, and they showed that this doesn't happen that often. We also not that sure about the effectiveness of. We know that the interest rate the interest rate hikes come at a very high cost. We saw that this created a lot of instability in the banking sector. It created the savings and loan crisis, for instance, in the U.S. There were like these banks that were giving credit mortgages to households. And they had a ceiling in the deposit rate that they could give to borrowers, and once interest rates went up, the deposit rates of all the other competing banks went up, which led all the depositors to go out of the saving and loans institutes, and this led them to have no money to pay back all the depositors that were a bit too slow in withdrawing their money. So of course there are like many costs related to interest rate hikes. One of the costs was employment. Employment went up from around like 5% to almost 11% when the interest rate were hiked, and this was considered something that was necessary. And when there was the recent inflation crisis, one of the first people that started talking about it was Larry Summers, and he said that the only way to get out of it was to increase interest rates aggressively, more aggressively than what the Fed actually did in reality. And what he was saying is that we needed to create unemployment. We needed to engineer a crisis, create a very high unemployment rate, because that's what we did in the 70s, and it worked. What happened today is that the rates were hiked, not as much as what he asked for, and inflation went down. Unemployment remained quite stable. There was no necessity of it wasn't necessary to create all this unemployment, and still inflation managed to go down. So, like the playbook that we kind of built based on the experience of the 70s may not apply as much as we think also to the economy where we live in today.
Well, I mean, the first reaction to that is, I mean, I know people treat, Krugman and Summers as these like oracles of, economy or whatever, but I'm not so sure about that. But I guess the world global economies look very different now than they did in the 70s. You can't, I mean, obviously it doesn't mean that you don't have some lessons to learn from it, but we didn't have globalization in the 70s like we do now. It's a completely different world 50 plus years later. To think that you just copy paste, I mean, maybe that's a bit of a,
no, it's not
elementary version of that, but
it is like
that's
from
ridiculous.
The same playbook. Yeah, I mean, it's the same playbook, right? Why do you do this? Well, we've been resolving banking crises the same way since 1864. So, there's a playbook. It seems to work. You go back to it. But it also goes back to that Milton Friedman quote, but it's always and everywhere a money phenomena, right? It's really important that's kind of the core belief, right? Now, let's think about why that might be problematic, because there's a great phrase that goes along with this, which is shootings are always and everywhere a ballistic phenomena. Right, which is true, but it tells you nothing about who got shot or why, right? So there's a causation question here, which is, does an increase in money, the monetarist view, the Friedman view, always lead to inflation? That's how you get inflation. Or are there inflationary forces which then lead you to produce more money, which would mean money's involved, but it's not necessarily causal? For much of the developing world, it's actually the other way around. Here's how it works. Let's say you're Brazil or Argentina. You're a giant agricultural economy. Or let's say you're one of the lithium countries now. That's a good example for everybody who wants lithium for green batteries and all the rest of it. Imagine the sodium batteries come online. What happens to the value of all those lithium mines? They collapse. What then happens to the countries like Chile that are mining a lot of lithium? Their exchange rate will go down because nobody will want to have their currency because they're not buying the lithium from them, right? Now, because these are huge agricultural commodity exporters, when those commodities crash, their exchange rate goes down. They don't make a lot of stuff. They have to import everything. So suddenly, your basic things like pharmaceuticals, food, stuff that you don't make, you need to bring that in, and it's suddenly way more expensive. How are you going to pay for that? You print money. So printing money is a consequence of the shock. Now, this is very much like the world of the 2020s. And I want to then tell you a different story about the 70s, right? So what happened? Well, basically, Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe ran out of gas, right? And the United States, which is hugely dependent on global supply chains for everything it doesn't make, because it doesn't make much of that stuff anymore, got punched in the face when basically they all shut down during COVID. So these are pure supply shocks, right? This is what basically supply fell, so prices are going to go up. So the impulse for inflation there isn't monetary, right? It's basically a supply shock. Now, if you think about the 70s, I told you this story about inflation becoming a problem, overheating labor markets, all the rest of it. Yeah, great. There's another way of telling the story. A whole bunch of supply shocks that lasted a decade. Whether it was fighting the Vietnam War off the books and not admitting the costs, shipping 500,000 people to Southeast Asia to fight that war and having 2.5 million in support. You have incredibly tight labor markets, so you're going to basically push up wages because of those. We had failed harvests, globally significant ones in Russia and Canada that pushed through global wheat prices and bust. We used to have a kind of stabilization fund for wheat in the world. We exhausted it, right? 73 and 79, oil prices quadrupled and then doubled, right? And we put mortgage payments in the CPI in 1978. That was just insane. I don't know why they did that. So that suddenly pushed up numbers. So basically, there's a whole bunch of, you can tell the story of the 70s is that first story. It's not wrong, but it's very incomplete because you can also think about it as a bunch of discrete supply shocks. Now, why did inflation fall? Go back to what Nick said, right? Was it raising the interest rates? Well, they didn't really raise them that far. In no country did they actually raise them above the rate of inflation amongst the big central banks. So what actually happens is basically the supply side of the economy adjusts, right? When you run out of Russian gas, it takes you a while to locate Qatar on a map and buy shit tons of gas from them. But that's eventually what Europe did, right? And then we eventually got over the COVID pandemic. We'd all bought that expensive couch from South Carolina because it was the only place you could get it, North Carolina, I should say. And then you bought the couch. The supply chains come back on, prices go back to normal, albeit at a higher level because of that levels problem. So if you think that, ultimately the 70s and the 2000s are really driven by supply shocks rather than driven by the government printing too much money, that tells you a different story about why you should, what the place of interest rates are and how we should think about these problems.
Tell me real quick, I want to get some of the case studies, but I just tell me real quick, how much of the COVID money, since we were kind of talking about more recent stuff, distributed to businesses was a driver of inflation during the Biden administration? How do we know and measure what was or wasn't a driver of inflation? Because as you mentioned in the beginning, we spent a shit ton of money. I think it was on the order of $6 trillion, at least doled out or whatever. But right. I mean, insane amounts of money.
On a $32 trillion economy, when you're shutting down 80% of the labor market, can you imagine what would happen if you didn't spend it?
No, I hear you. It is a lot, but it's compared to what we do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So how much of that, though, did impact or influence inflation, if at all?
Nick, you know the numbers on this one. What's the estimates?
No, so it's difficult to say the money specifically to businesses because usually people evaluate the stimulus as a whole. And I checked, the Biden stimulus was around 1.9 trillion. And I think I remember checking the aid to businesses variable inside that stimulus was around 8% of that. So it was very small compared to the stimulus checks or all the aid that Biden provided, for instance, for local governments and so on. So there was a lot of money that was also going just into financing vaccines and so on. There are some estimates about how much government spending influenced inflation. And there are some estimates from the San Francisco Fed. I don't remember the precise number, but it's some percentage points, like I think 1 or 2 percentage points of inflation, which can be a lot. But what they even said in their studies that these estimates are very uncertain because, of course, it was at the very beginning of inflation, so there wasn't enough data to prove it. But it's also very difficult to say that this money went to fuel inflation because there were so many moving parts. So as you mentioned, or Mark was mentioning it, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine that, of course, made gas prices more costly. This was more impactful in Europe than in the US because Europe is more dependent on Russian gas. But also all the COVID-related disruptions. But there is also an interesting study from the New York Fed that shows that a lot of the COVID stimulus that went to people, so not necessarily to business, was actually spent in repaying their debt, like repaying their credit card. So it's very difficult to argue that this spending was inflationary in this case because the argument will be that you get the stimulus check and what you do is to buy your new IKEA furniture and this stimulates demand. There isn't enough furniture out there to really cope with this demand, so prices go up necessarily. But if people are just using this money to pay their debt, it's a bit more difficult to argue that.
Yeah, and another simple one like this is, how many Biden economies are there? One. About 30 countries in the world had inflation. So you're pulling an N of 1 to explain 30. Just doesn't work, right?
It's a fair point.
So, so again, and that just draws me back to sort of, and this was the surprising part of the book. I mean, I didn't think there was a story to tell, but I think that we discovered the story as we were doing it, which is perhaps we can really think of this as basically much more driven by supply shocks rather than monetary shocks. And, thinking about Biden in this way is one of the things that got us on this, because there was a singular fixation in the United States about, he's spending money and that's what's driving inflation. And you're like, well, look around the world. Nobody else is spending money the same way and they've all got inflation. So surely there's something else going on, or there could be discrete causes. Maybe it's just terribly bad luck in a sense that what you get is a COVID shutdown of supply chains that hits the United States and the rest of the world. But then you get a huge energy shock that primarily affects Europe, but affects global markets for gas and other such commodities. So,
can you tell us about the part of the book that was really interesting about how inflation is related to class? Meaning with lower economic classes that suffer the most from inflation. I also thought that was really interesting. And it does seem how you talk about in the book, like it wasn't like you started out with that necessarily. It sort of kind of came out. How does that work? How does that happen?
Well, I mean, we spoke about this before. I mean, this is just the notion that ultimately where you are in the income distribution tells you something about how much of your income goes towards consumption. So if you're in the 20th or 40th percentile of the income distribution, probably 60 to 80% of your income goes on consumption. If inflation is ultimately acts like a tax on consumption, that hits you more. If you're at the top end, the top 1%, you're sitting on things like stocks of oil companies, which went boom during the pandemic. And also you spend a vanishingly small part of your overall income on consumption. So the inflation effect for you is much less. So that's there. What we get into at the end of the book, and Nick can talk about this one, is essentially sort of, the winners and losers, if you want to put it that way, which is, who benefits from inflation, and it's not beyond sort of individuals. So, Nick, if you want to talk about our winners and losers, that would probably be a good segue into that one.
Yeah.
No, definitely. So I think in the book we also explain why it's very difficult to find winners or losers, because it's not just because everything is difficult in economics and uncertain. I think I said the word uncertainty 1,000 times today. But it's also because, like we are categorized in terms of baskets, as I was saying before. Yeah. But of course, like you can be someone that consumes something, but you can also be a worker that works in a factory that produces that. So it's very difficult to say whether you win or lose by prices going up in a certain category of good. Then, of course, like based on your income, if prices are all going up, then it's very difficult that you find yourself being a winner in this case. If we have to find winners of the inflation, of the recent inflation crisis, well, definitely the ones that come to mind are energy companies, because many of the companies that are seeing their profits going up are energy companies, because what they do is to not only to charge, they're charging higher prices, and other companies that are maybe charging higher prices themselves are charging higher prices simply because the energy costs more for them. So it's very difficult to say whether all the corporations are winners of inflation simply because they're charging higher prices, because indeed mainly it's energy that has become more costly. So this is definitely one winner category. Another winner category that seems a bit weird to enumerate as the winner of inflation is banks. Not really because of inflation. They're generally losers of inflation, and banks are very anti-inflation because inflation erodes the value of debt. And since banks are creditor, they're lending you money, they're seeing the value of their assets, of those loans, that is decreasing over time. But it's actually because of the policy reaction that comes after inflation. So if the central bank is hiking rates, then banks are allowed to hike their rates on the mortgages that they give you, on the loans that they give to firms. And while they also adjust usually deposit rate a bit, and we saw it with the saving and loan crisis, they don't do it as much. They don't increase it as much as they do on the lending rate. So in a nutshell, banks are really getting their profits out of this difference between what they charge on loan and what they give on deposits. It's the spread between these two rates. And what we see in the data is that they really increase this gap, and they started profiting more by getting higher margins on these rates. So banks can be seen as winners, but also when you look at banks, there are differences. So there are smaller banks that manage to benefit way less than larger banks in this. And what is interesting is also to see at how governments can play a role in this, because so far we really talked about higher rates as the only way to solve inflation and the only way to fight inflation. But actually, there are other policies that governments can put in place that are also more targeted, that can help smoothing or mitigating the impact of inflation on the poorer or the losers of inflation. And one of the things, for instance, that some governments did in Europe was to apply windfall taxes. So they started taxing these excess profits of energy companies over banks. And they use those gains, those revenues from those profits to allow themselves to, for instance, cap prices on transport for people that are lower income, or cap prices on gas. It depends. Different governments decided to use different mixes of these policies. But this shows that interest rate is not necessarily the only solution to really mitigate the cost of inflation, because interest rate acts on everyone in the same way. But since we are different in what we can afford, it impacts poorer people a bit more.
I have three final questions for you guys. The first question here is about some of the case examples you give. So I want to ask about one case and then one that's maybe not in the book if you know about it. So Argentina has had hyperinflation, I believe. They've had, I think their current, it was very, very high. I think at the moment it's 45% or something like that, inflation, something like that. So maybe you can talk about that. And again, each country has its own history, but they're doing a sort of experiment now with their current administration and trying to figure things out. I don't know how effective that is or is not. And then one that's not in the book, but one I'm curious about, if you know about it, is also in Turkey as well. Turkey, I think last year had 70% inflation rate, which is, I don't know, you just live day to day at that point, right? Nothing means anything anymore, right? You just don't. I think it's now 35%. I think it's reduced, but yeah, Argentina has had a history of challenges, but the Turkey one is interesting to me as well, because they've had relatively a stable government in some sense, and they had the big earthquake and obviously COVID and things like that. But yeah, just if you know anything, it's not in the book. I figured I'd throw it in there just to as a curveball. But yeah, what these two countries? What do you make about the inflation?
We can start with Turkey because we actually know something about Argentina, so that one's easier. So the Turkey Erdogan, who the guy who runs the shop there, has a very interesting, to be polite or heterodox understanding of inflation, is actually caused by higher interest rates. Right, which is actually one that mass publics tend to agree with, because what they think is the following: well, that just raises the cost of everything, right? So clearly that's going to feed into inflation. And of course, then we go, but you see, what happens is that makes things more expensive, and credit gets rationed, and then the economy slows down, and then inflation goes down. It's the second order effects we're interested in, not really the price effects, right? And he looks at that and basically goes, well, what happens if we have high sustained inflation? Well, it means that basically the currency is worth less. Awesome. That means our exports get really, really competitive. So why don't we just grow through exports using inflation as a way of artificially cheapening our stuff and get market share? Does it work?
That's
not
one
really.
way to do it.
Not really. But I think that's basically, they weren't just doing this for random shits and giggles, right? I mean, they actually thought this was a way to do it, and it turned out it didn't really work, and you just ended up with lots of poorer people in Turkey. But nonetheless, there was some thinking behind it. You got anything else on Turkey, Nicolò? No, nothing on that. You want to take us on to Argentina? Tell us Argentina's tale of woe.
Yeah.
So no, Argentina is an interesting case because, of course, also in that case, spending and too much money really played a role. There was a lot of spending that definitely was related to inflation, and some austerity policies that were applied. So like reducing sharply the spending did work. Some others worked a bit less. The particular case was in 1991. There were very sharp, very tough austerity policies, and they managed to reduce inflation and bring it like down to, I think it was like around below 20%, which for Argentina was low, because indeed, as you were mentioning, inflation was very high. And this is an interesting case because Milei looks like he's doing the same now. He's reducing spending a lot in Argentina, and inflation seemed to be adjusting. It was around, even like the values were going beyond 200% on a monthly basis, and now, as you were saying, they're around 47%. But the question is whether this interpretation of just like augmenting or reducing public spending is enough. And when you look at the case of Argentina in the 90s, Argentina was also put in a so-called golden straitjacket, because it was its pesos. It's like its domestic currency was pegged to the dollar, so 1 peso valued $1, and this seemed to work for a while in keeping inflation stable. But then 10 years later, in 2001, when Argentina had a credibility crisis, there was a shock, and people like investors started thinking that this peg currency that was not going to be able to be sustained. Then they started like to take their capital out, and this created a credibility crisis that became also domestic. So people started to withdraw their money. They were mainly dollars, so there was a lot of debt denominated in dollar in the banking sector. Started to withdraw in their money from banks because they wanted to save their dollars, thinking that this would have not been able to be translated in the same amount of pesos in the future. So of course, like there were factors that seemed to work in a certain time period but didn't work in another. And I don't know if Mark wants to complement.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go with the bigger historical story on this, which we've kind of touched on already, which is, monetary factors, absolutely. You got a lot of, as we call it, populist money going around the place. I mean, essentially the way that Perón, who ran the shop for a while, cemented his coalition was just printing money and handing it out to clients, right? I mean, loads of this goes on in Argentina to this day. It's what kept the coalition going. Is that the sole cause? Well, you can look at other Latin American countries that don't have Perón and Peronism, and they tend to have high inflation too. Why? Because they're commodity producers. And what happens is the commodity starts to become valuable, so you rip up more land and you plant more commodities, and people are like, this is great, give us the commodity. And eventually what happens is you end up with way more commodity than can be absorbed, and the markets crash, right? There's these kind of endogenous crashes in commodities markets all the time. And if you are importing literally everything else, because you don't make anything apart from the stuff that you specialize in as this commodity export, then the price of all that goes up. And the only way you're going to be able to pay for that is if you print it. But the people on the other side of the trade who are sending you the stuff as exports, they're like, well, wait a minute, you guys, your exchange rates collapse, so you need to give me 10 times as many pesos now. And they're like, sure, we could give you 10 times as many pesos. So we run the printing press, we give you 10 times as many pesos. Well, what does that do? That basically just creates a price level crisis where basically you've got far too much money chasing far too few goods. So again, it's not that the monetary theory is wrong. It just needs to be seen in a bigger context, particularly for commodity exporters in the developing world. That's why these countries tend to have endemically high inflation.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Let me say something about Malay. What's interesting about Malay is he's done something I didn't think you could do, which is basically put together a kind of pro-austerity coalition. And the way you can do this, and he was very clever about this, is that he took 1/3 of the rich, 1/3 of the middle, and 1/3 of the poor. That's his effective electoral coalition. And what he did in getting the middle and the poor in particular was he basically told the following story. The other side are never going to solve inflation. And what that means is every day you go to work, you're earning less money. And if you run this for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you're just talking about poverty. So I can come in and give me a chance. I'll kill all the monetary factors. We'll open up markets. We'll make Argentina more attractive for diverse foreign investment, etc. And it'll hurt like hell, but what have you got to lose? Because you're getting poorer every day. And he was not wrong, and he really managed to pull that coalition together. So I think what he's doing there is really interesting. Now the question is, will it work? Because if it is just public spending out of control, there should be no inflation problem. Well, he's got it well under control. Why is there still an inflation problem? Because of the exchange rate side and because of the import dependence. That doesn't go away.
Yeah, that's a good point. Argentina has flirted with, leftist policies and leftist governments. They've had the right governments, and none of it really works. People are kind of frustrated. Just like, listen. And so I get it. I get that. Listen, if I lived in Argentina, I'd be like, why not? We've tried. They had leftist governments for 15, 20 years. I get it. Okay, so here, I'm curious for your guys' thoughts, especially, we've had all of this talk about tariffs, and I was telling a friend of mine, I said, I have to actually look up which tariffs actually went into place, because it was, we're going to do these crazy tariffs, and then it changed, Trump changes his mind, and then it's, well, there's going to be all these exceptions. Well, it's going to extend the date. And I had to actually look up what actually got put in place. I think it was China. There was some, at least a certain amount. There was something ridiculous, like 10% for every single country that we were connected with. So, yeah, the question here is what is the deflation estimate after Trump's tariffs take effect here? Is there an estimate of when prices will become, the demand will drop and then the spending will drop? What do we think in terms of deflation of sorts with kind of Trump's tariffs, if at all?
Well, if anything, we think about inflation. We don't think about deflation, because you're by policy making stuff more expensive. Right, that's the point of it, right? And the idea behind this, which I don't, again, isn't wrong, is the United States stopped making loads of stuff about 20 or 30 years ago and has been important ever since. When you do that, you lose the skills to do it, which is kind of problematic, right? But also you become incredibly vulnerable because you have to get it from somewhere else. And ultimately you're paying for this with digital dollars called treasury notes. And eventually those treasury notes, this huge deficit, this trade deficit you've got, has to be paid for in some sense by real goods and services. And you've got a big structural deficit. So what does that mean? It means that there needs to be some rebalancing. And one of the ways you do this is by raising tariffs. Biden tried this with the Inflation Reduction Act to basically do green reindustrialization behind what were essentially Trump's tariffs. And Trump doesn't like the green stuff, so all of that's got to go, but he does like tariffs. So you push up tariffs and you make things really expensive, because that way you're going to force companies to come and make stuff in the United States. That at least is the theory. It's a bit like Turkey's theory on inflation. You can see there's a logic to it, but doesn't mean that it's going to work. But if anything, rather than deflation, you'd expect an inflationary response. Nick, what have you got on that?
Yeah. What do you think, Nick?
No, I think the logic there is very simple. I don't have much to add. It's just that there is a lot of consensus among economists that the tariffs, as they were presented on what was Liberation
Day, when I was liberated from 10% of my retirement.
Exactly.
What was that? April 1st or 2nd or something? April 2nd? Yeah.
Should have been April 1. That would have been even better.
That would have been hilarious, right?
Yeah. And so that they were going to be inflationary, and this is, I think, it's gonna open up interesting questions about who are going to be the winners and losers of these tariffs. Just so you know, Mark, everyone is telling me, so is the next book that you're going to write on tariffs?
Yeah, no, we're definitely not writing a book on tariffs. Because it would change every 3 days.
Right.
I mean, it would literally be impossible to do so.
Maybe we can do a blog about that.
Yeah, exactly.
We can update it more frequently.
We'll call it tariff schmariffs. I mean, no idea what's going on.
Exactly. So no, but the thing is, it's going to be inflationary because simply because import prices are going to go up. So this is going to be also less of a debate about where inflation comes from.
Yeah,
in that
you've
case,
done it by policy.
Because you know that it's already coming out from.
It's a policy-induced supply shock. It's like you've basically engineering a supply shock. Stuff from you're buying elsewhere is becoming more expensive, and you want it to be more expensive for its second-order consequences, which you hope is reindustrialization.
The point, though, I mean, I do see some of the logic. I mean, we are kind of getting killed. We are vulnerable. We are dependent, and we're not building the same skills. I don't know if tariffing your way out of it is the answer, but we also subsidize large parts of Europe in some ways. You know, there's a lot of ways that, I mean, there are some logical things here. I think the tariff way of doing it is probably not the wisest, because at the end, the consumer does have to pay for it. I mean, they do. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer.
And I mean, just to add, tariffs are not necessarily bad always and everywhere. They were really helpful tools in some countries in their first development stages to develop. They're still used by many developed economies on certain strategic sectors. Adding a tariff to every country in the world at the same time and with a certain floor that is the same for everyone, that can be very dangerous.
I'd also caution against this language of we're getting killed. I mean, ultimately, what's happened is American corporations
that's his
America.
That's not my.
No, I know, but it's worth clarifying here, right? The American corporations upped tools and went to China to take advantage of two things: cheap labor, better infrastructure, and a comparative advantage in environmental despoilation. They then were able to boost their profit margins massively and sell stuff back to us. 40% of the stuff coming out of China is still coming out of multinational corporations, primarily American ones. We literally did this to ourselves, right? And as for the whole sort of Europe's ripping us off, right? Please explain this one to me. In 2008, the European economy and the American economy were exactly the same size, more or less. Give a couple of $100 million, right? More or less same size. Europe is now 1/3 smaller. So that's an amazing rip-off when you get to rip someone off and you get a third poorer relative to the person you've been ripping off. So this stuff is bullshit.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, final question is, you guys wrote a book on inflation. Where do you, again, no predictions, I'm not trying to tell you to predict, but how do we, as we, the current administration and after and things like that, but even more globally, how do we see where inflation goes? We came out of a pandemic, but where do you see it kind of averaging or leveling off where it's not as high? And how do we have better proactive measures to kind of manage, I guess, inflation, I guess, here in the U.S. or what other countries could do?
Take it away, Nick.
Well, I can think about two factors, and maybe Mark can complement or add other factors. So a part of tariffs, indeed. Two elements that are gonna probably make things more pricey are climate change and an aging population. So climate change, because a lot of the stuff that we buy comes from agriculture, for instance, and as agriculture is increasingly more affected by climate disaster, this is gonna likely reduce the supply that is produced or make it more costly, to protect these type of goods in the future, protect them from droughts, from floods, and so on. And this is gonna likely increase the prices of food, which we saw was a very important component in the recent inflation. Is this going to be fast or slow? Well, this will depend on how fast climate will change and how fast it will translate into natural disaster. And food is one aspect, but of course this can affect many other components. The aging population is simply the fact that we have people that are getting older, less people that are being born, and this reduces a lot the labor supply. And unless we really think that AI and robots are going to replace us so quickly and are going to be able to replace so many tasks at the same time that we're not going to need so many workers, which I don't think will be the case, then we're going to have to do the same stuff to produce the same amount of goods with a very reduced labor force, because there will be less people that can take over the jobs that older people leave. So this is another long-term force that will likely bring higher prices in the future.
I'd add two onto that. The first one is the usual response to declining labor force participation is immigration. And instead we have a government that wants to deport 12 million people. So that's absolutely going to increase prices if you go that way, which is by design. I mean, basically, the sort of the national populist conservative agenda, the sort of like the MAGA economics, if you want to put it that way, is put up tariffs, get rid of the immigrants, and then basically what you end up doing is making labor really expensive. But to access the American market, companies need to come to the United States. So to pay those wages, they will invest in a lot of technology, which will allow them to pay those wages, and that kind of like brings back the economy of the 50s. Problem, they won't employ people, they'll just employ robots. So it's not going to work. So there's that. If they ever come back at all, they might just decide to wait out.
Or they'll just invest in other places.
Yeah, exactly. That's it, exactly. Second one is also was I think an insurance markets. This is also a climate change knock on, right? So a good example, This is Florida, right? Florida used to have like 15 different insurers. Now they've got an overburdened state plan, which if they ever have to pay out is bankrupt, and 4 actual private insurance companies. Now the private insurance companies are insured by other companies called reinsurers, and reinsurers are the people who guard against catastrophes, and they have a very interesting set of financial instruments called catastrophe bonds, which they use to basically manage this risk. Climate change is just throwing all those models into disarray. And if you can't get insurance, think of a very simple thing. How do you get a mortgage? And if you can't get a mortgage, how's going to build the house? So what's going to happen to house prices if you can't build new ones? And when you build new ones, you can't get insurance on it. So there's lots of ways. And I think the last one is deglobalization. I mean, the sort of the one-time trick of 500 million Chinese workers joining the labor force, pushing down wages and prices, has been done. It's over, right? You can't do it again. And if we're deciding to actually decouple and deglobalize, then by definition, the deflation that we had from the 1990s and 2000s will have to become inflations in the 2020s and 2030s.
That's a good point.
So that's why you need to read the book. Because it might be low just now, but it's not going to be low forever.
You guys are going to look like Nostradamus. And
exactly. Who were those guys? That was very clever. Though.
That was, wow, they really nailed it.
I really saw that one coming.
Right. Well, listen, Mark, Nick, you guys were absolutely fantastic. I'm really, really happy to talk to you about something that people talk more about, and it's really, really important. And so the book's great. You guys were great, and this is a real treat. So it's a big, big thanks.
Yeah, it's great fun.
It's a pleasure.
Cool.